Hello, and welcome. Today I'm going to give a very brief overview of rituals and some of the work that has been done in our lab. So rituals, first of all, if you think about it, like all societies have rituals, and anthropologists have pointed out that rituals is a human universal. All cultures, all societies, anywhere in the world have rituals, and there's also some evidence now, quite strong evidence emerging that even some animals, some other non-human primates and even birds have ritualistic-like behavior. So that, of course, raises all sorts of questions. But before we get into that, we have to also realize that if we talk about ritual, there's a huge literature out there. Here is a summary, a couple of quick snapshots over the literature. As you can see, from pretty much the year 2000 onwards, the literature has just exploded with, in some cases, over 2,500 articles published per year on ritual. You just have to imagine that number. So there are so many different perspectives, so many different ideas of what ritual is, what it does, how it does things to us, how can we use ritual for all sorts of purposes. To just give you an idea, so that this is some work that's going to be out in Religion, Brain, and Behavior very shortly. To just give you an idea of some of the big clusters of research. So for example, up here, it's keywords and then clustering the keywords of studies published in the last 20 years. So what we can see here, the blue cluster shows or like captures rituals that have something to do with health, for example, OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, or anxiety, depression issues, and like how ritual behavior or ritualistic like behavior is similar, or features in these disorders, or can be used, rituals can be used to help people deal with these kind of problems. Then up here, the green cluster is a very US focused community health related research domain. In the center here we have rituals that, or studies that study rituals with keywords specifically highlighting context and risk. And then we have a very diverse cluster here, which features evolution, which is connected to all of them, but somewhat on the outside, and captures a lot of different perspectives on cultural issues, consumption. So in marketing, politics, issues of power and ritual, archaeology, archaeological perspectives, etc. If we break that down and display all of this a little bit differently, so this is research over the last 10 years looking at what kind of keywords go together and how central these keywords are in the overall literature, and then within each of the clusters how coherent this is. So we can actually differentiate between modal themes, so very central topics, clusters of keywords that are also very tightly connected to each other, so there seems to be some kind of maturing of research. There are niche themes that are tightly coupled keywords, so suggest some like very clearly defined research areas, but they are not very central in the overall network. Then we have basic themes, so very central themes, but not very clearly differentiated, not very clearly or not very cohesive in a way. And then down here we have emerging or declining themes that are not very central and not very coherent in a way. And one thing that is very clear here is all the research on behavior, evolution, religion, and cooperation is very central. So there's a lot of work going on there. But at the same time, it has not really emerged yet as a very nicely, cohesively organized field of research. On the other hand, just to give you an idea, work that focuses on scale development, prevalence of various disorders, specifically anxiety and OCD, and also work with children here. That is very central, as you can see here. The green points here, it's very central, and the blue points, green blue points here, is very central in the last 10 years, and it's also very internally cohesive and coherent. So it's an emerging motor theme. So that just gives you a bit of an overview. Another way to actually understand the structure of this research is to look at the most important citations in these articles that were published in the last 20 years. And this is the a way of, or an attempt to visualize these important sources. And what is very interesting here is we have this pink cluster here, which captures a lot of the historical sources. So we have Catherine Bell's work, Rappaport's work, John Turner, Clifford Geertz, like dealing with more anthropological perspectives on ritual. Then we also have a closely connected kind of yellowish cluster here, which has this more kind of modern evolutionary perspective. So linking the classic anthropological, sociological literature to evolutionary thinking. And then we also have, like a classic clinical cluster with kind of methods and like design issues or classification issues. So, for example, we have the DSM in various versions here because obviously OCD behavior, one of the important definitions is that it involves ritualistic-like behavior. But then we also have all sorts of other very interesting clusters there. There's a ayahuasca cluster, so some work that focuses on ayahuasca as an important facilitator of ritualistic behavior, etc., etc. But that is just to give you an idea of the diversity of perspectives that are out there. So when I talk about ritual, I'm actually going to really be talking at this intersection here between the pink and the yellowish clusters there, which focus on the link between anthropology and evolutionary biological thinking and how psychologists have tried to contribute to that. So the big question in this line of research is, why ritual? Why do we have these very strange behaviors? Because if we go back, like at in the height of the Ice Age, so as humans moved out of Africa, moved into Europe, very harsh and hostile conditions. So, like it was very difficult to find food, was very difficult to protect yourself against other predators. And humans, instead of, like dealing with these challenges and threats in a straightforward manner, they spend time and energy to actually, waste their time making flutes. Here are some bone flutes that were recently found and described in, like in the Danube Valley from, like the Middle Ice Ages. And apparently they're nicely tuned and they rival in terms of like the tonality and fabrication. They rival things that humans have done during the medieval times. So, like, why would we spend time on wasting time on something like this if we are in such a harsh and hostile environment? And another example is, for example, the famous temple structure in Göbekli Tepe on the border between Syria and Turkey, where, like as humans, they were still hunter-gatherers and they haven't settled down yet. So we don't have evidence of permanent settlement structures, but humans congregated for extended period of time and built these amazing ritualistic structure with these stone steels. So you have to imagine, you don't have tools, you don't have a tractor, you don't have a crane, and you chisel away with very primitive stone tools. Still, you chisel away to build something that is quite intricate and make figurines and frescoes and representations of human ritualistic activity. You have to ask yourself, people spend probably days or weeks trying to carve, some ritualistic scene into stone, and it was a central activity for humans. So why on earth did we do this? So what are possible explanations here? And so, as you can imagine, like researchers have, like differed widely on these perspectives. Um, but as you can also, like possibly remember from your history sessions, like there were behaviors like marching in line, like for example, the one of the earliest Chinese emperors, like he thought it was so important for him to have marching soldiers in line that, like in his tomb, there are these thousands of terracotta warriors. And we have evidence from all major emerging civilizations that, like these ritualistic parades were very central. So marching in line was something that was central to modern or to historical ancient warfare. But then you think, like, why are we still marching? So why is this kind of really superfluous kind of human behavior, marching in line, in synchrony, still here with us today in the days of modern warfare, where like a trigger could annihilate pretty much all of humanity? Why is this still with us? And so, like we have to go to some extent back to our ancient past, but we also have to think about like what does it do in our modern day environment. And like the classic view for a long time has been, anthropologists, sociologists, to think about like the meaning structures that people create around it, which then like is used to explain, for example, how ritualistic actions take place. And I will give you some snapshots of those kind of ideas later on. Um, Biologists and evolutionary biologists, on the other hand, have been thinking about like actually what happens if we do certain things. Does that just the sheer act of doing something have some kind of impact on what we are thinking, how we are perceiving the world? And to give you some idea here, Malinowski, a very famous anthropologist working in the wider Polynesian world, or in the wider Pacific world, he observed that that ritualistic behaviors were particularly common before individuals embarked on very dangerous journeys. So there seems to be some kind of connection between danger, uncertainty, and ritualistic behavior. And so Martin Lang and colleagues, they were the first to really test that. So what they did is they got people into the lab, stressed them out tremendously, and then afterwards they observed their behavior. And what they observed was that individuals that were stressed became more rigid, they used more repetitive behaviors. So there seems to be a link between being stressed and then subsequently performing more ritualistic like actions. And one of the ideas was that potentially this ritualistic like action calms people down, right? So that's basically the old argument by Malinowski, which was first kind of tested whether there's a link between anxiety and stress and ritualistic behavior. And so then, Johannes came in and he thought like, wait, they claim this, but they actually did not properly test whether the increased ritualization decreases anxiety. So he used an adaptation of that protocol, stressing people out, and Johannes did a marvelous job being like this really dictatorial kind of examiner that was sitting there in a white lab coat and like just stress people out because they had to perform various kind of simple cognitive tasks, but under these conditions of being in a lab room with somebody who's just staring at you is really stress inducing. And Johannes hooked people up with blood pressure equipment that measures your blood pressure, heart rate, and he was also able to actually capture behavior. We asked him afterwards to clean an object. The object is there. They could either clean it just as whichever way they wanted, or we had some other conditions where we gave them specific instructions, and then we captured the actual movement through some movement detecting devices. And really crucial here is those individuals that were stressed and performed more ritualistic-like behavior, right? So they became more rigid, they became more repetitive in their behavior when they started to clean this object. Actually, they started to calm down, right? So there's a change in heart rate for those individuals that were in the stress condition, and those that were in the stress condition and had a higher ritualistic like behavior, more repetitive, more rigid behavior, they actually calm down faster and more effectively, right? So really there is, like two-way feedback loops between what we're thinking and then how that impacts our body, and what our body does, how that feeds back into our thinking. And so we have to remember this and think about like how these two-way, top down, so from our mind to our body, and bottom up from our body to our mind, how these processes and dynamics are taking place. The second thing we have to really think about is rituals are hugely diverse, right? So rituals have so many different features, and anthropologists have been, have done an exceptional job, like describing these minute details in different rituals around the world. And the interesting question now is to break these rituals down and start focusing on central elements that may actually, in this kind of bottom up, so body to mind pathway, might explain why rituals have been with us for such a long time, right? And so to, like give you a first big snapshot of what particularly evolutionary psychologists and anthropologists and biologists have been thinking about, is that the reason why we have rituals is because they enable social connection, right? So they bind us together by doing something, even if it doesn't make sense. If you really think through it logically, it doesn't really help us. It bonds us, and that is important enough for these rituals to be with us for such a long time. The second one, and you can already kind of, you would have guessed that already by the work by Martin and Johannes, rituals help us to regulate our emotions. We calm down or we get very excited, and we can use ritualistic actions to manipulate, regulate our emotions. And the third one is task focus. A classic example would be, like just before you have, a big exam, you do some specific type of action that you always do before an exam, which kind of keeps you focused on the task, right? So these three areas are thought, or these three domains are thought to be the driving forces why we have rituals even today. Now, in the next couple of slides, I'm going to give you some examples from research that tries to understand and demonstrate how rituals actually achieve that. Right, so let's focus on one important aspect, which is in-group rituals, synchronized action. So people doing things at the same time. And one of the prominent theories is, or one of the starting theories was basically that the synchronized actions help us to signal to each other that we're in this together. The kapahaka before an important rugby game is obviously like a classic example. Like you hype yourself up, and implicitly you signal to each other, we're in this together, we're like in sync. This also goes back to the beginning of modern sociology, so Emil Durkheim. So he is very, I think this is actually the Durkheim, one of the Durkheim references there. He's in this pink cluster. He observed that people in a ritual have this kind of intellectual moral conformity. Everything is common to all. So the movements are stereotyped. Everyone performs the same movements in the same circumstances, and so this kind of translates into some kind of conformity of thought, right? So so the individual nearly becomes one with the whole group. And So this was the idea of this kind of, that started the idea of the importance of synchronized movement. So Scott Wildermuth and Chip Heath, they did some very classic studies, drawing also on Bill McNeil's work from history, where he also, like observed, for example, marching in sync, and how important that was for humans and human societies. So what they did is they got people to do very meaningless things like walking around campus or singing the Canadian anthem. Uh, Remember, these are US students, so singing the Canadian anthem doesn't really make a lot of sense to them, and passing a cup at the same time in synchrony. And that made people, just these very simple acts of doing that together, that made strangers trust each other and share money afterwards. And so one of the intriguing ideas of how this is actually possible is linked to the idea of mirror neurons, where, like people like Isolati discovered that when monkeys see a particular action performed by, for example, their keeper, the same neurons would fire in their prefrontal, premotor area, as if they would also as if they were doing the action themselves. So there's some kind of link between firing of neurons when we do an action, and also firing of the same set of neurons when we see others perform that action. And the idea here is that if you do the action together with others, in your mind there's a start of this kind of self-other blurring, because you do the action, the other person is doing the action, and so there is some kind of merging of these perceptions. This also, or a complementary view, is that all of this has to do with shared attention. If you do something together, you pay attention to the same stimuli, and so you also signal that you're interested in the same activities, which again, like has this powerful kind of self-other merging dynamic. So that's Michael Tomasello's work, suggesting that, like this shared attention, shared intentionality mechanic is very important at the neural level. And so if we move into the lab and do these very stupid tasks where you basically raise your arm in synchrony, or you walk on the spot, work that Paul Radish has done in our lab, we can start in, like manipulating these conditions. We can start, testing some of these ideas more carefully. And so one of Paul's contributions was actually that these ideas, this shared attention and shared, this kind of coalitional signaling is actually potentially one and the same mechanism, and you can integrate them in this kind of reinforcement of cooperation model, where synchrony basically, so others perceive that you're in sync, that signals cooperation, and it also signals unity. But obviously you also have a common goal, you share attention, which also directly impacts cooperation. So there's actually these different explanations are not necessarily in conflict with each other and can be integrated. Right. So, and how he did that experimentally, he would give people either a group goal or an individual goal. So either, you have to move individually with a beat, or you have to work with these others in this room to work on a beat. And then we manipulated either synchrony, so you had to work together to move in time with the others, or work individually to stay in time with a particular beat, or sequentially. So this was an important condition, because we wanted to see to what extent just coordinating your actions with others, but not being in synchrony, actually has an impact or not, because that is very important for this kind of mirror neuron explanation. And then obviously we also had asynchrony, where people were doing different things at different speeds. And what he found in some of his key studies is that group goals together with synchrony led to much higher cooperative behavior. Nearly everyone afterwards cooperated, whereas in most other conditions, cooperation was around 50% actually. right? So moving together with others with a common goal in synchrony seems to really shift people's cooperative tendencies towards the social end. Obviously, like rituals also invoke very strong emotions, right? So we also have to think about the emotional part, right? And again, it goes back to Durkheim's observations, where he actually commented on that just the act of being with others, doing things in a collective, creates this kind of electricity, this kind of collective effervescence, which may be important for our understanding of ritual. So that is obviously related to that second component, helps us to regulate emotions. So now, if we think about this connecting us to others, so the social connection and emotional regulation tasks, people have often done these tasks in labs, and this allows us to actually look at both of these components and start figuring out whether and how they actually work together. So Renita in our lab, she did a meta-analysis of all these studies that have been conducted. In the end, we had 42 independent studies that we could use. And so she started coding all sorts of features of these analyses, and also separated them out in terms of behavior. So, like, was there a behavioral component focused on others? Perceptions of others, so basically whether you trust them or not. Cognition, so how much, for example, you remember about what others did. And affect, so basically your emotions. And so what she now did is she tried to look at the effects of synchrony versus some other control conditions, typically social coordination, where you just have to coordinate your actions with others, but you're not actually in synchrony. And what she found was very strong effects for all of these. And the interesting thing, in particular, if we think about the mirror neuron hypothesis, because this is the comparison between synchrony versus social coordination. So basically, you coordinate your actions with others, but you're not in synchrony. In synchrony, there seems to be an added component which speaks to the possibility or plausibility of the mirror neuron hypothesis. At the same time, if we look at affect, it was significant. So there's something going on with synchrony, but the effect is not quite as strong. So actually, being in a group, doing something with others, may already lead to kind of a positive result, right? So positive emotional effects, right? So obviously, mirror neurons may not be important for affect that much. What's happening with group size? Group size is a very interesting variable here because it's directly relevant for both the attention mechanisms as well as this kind of collective effervescence. Higher groups or a higher number of people in a group actually decrease perception and cognition effects, which is central for mirror neuron explanations, because if you have more individuals around you, you cannot pay attention to all of them to the same extent. So we could actually expect that the effects become weaker over with increasing number. For behavior, actually, we saw a slight increase, so that is not quite compatible. And most importantly, affect really increased with a larger number of individuals, so which speaks to this kind of collective effervescence idea. But obviously, we don't quite understand of how this comes about. So this was all in the lab. So what happens actually if we move the research back into the wild? And here I just want to quickly talk about work that was done by Rowan, another student in our lab a few years ago, where we looked at naturally occurring rituals. So, we followed people in the community, we coded what was going on every 5 minutes, some kind of ethnographic descriptions, and importantly, we got people to code this both in terms of exact synchrony, so everyone was doing everything at the same time. Then a second condition, which was more kind of coordination, complementary synchrony, what we called it in this particular case, where people were doing things together, but not necessarily the same thing at the same time, and then also no synchrony. And so we gave people a pre-test, and we gave them a post-test, and we used an economic game, so basically where we gifted them money, and then they had to decide how to distribute that money, whether they actually keep it or they distribute and share it with others, which actually increases everyone's outcome if everyone shares their gifted share. But you're actually individually better off to just keep it yourself and hope that everyone else gifts their, or shares their money. Right, so we were able to compare pre-post what is going on, and we had a really hard measure of cooperation, or social of cooperation effects afterwards. And what we found is, in exact synchrony conditions, overall we had much higher across the board effects compared to no synchrony or complementary synchrony. We could ask, are there negative sides to synchrony? Because it seems to be such a lovely thing. Everyone loves everyone. You trust each other more. You share resources more, and you seem to be better emotionally regulated. The question here now is, if we think about creativity, there are two different components of creativity. There's divergent thinking, which we often think about when we say creativity, coming up with new ideas, thinking outside the box, like coming up with something really cool and new. And we have convergent thinking, where like people integrate information that is coming in and try and come up with the best possible solution. This is often, convergent thinking is often not something that people have on their minds when they think about creativity, but it is important nevertheless, because it helps us to find best options within a specific situation if we share information in a group. And so again, coming back to Durkheim, this conformity of thought could actually mean that we may be less creative in the sense of having less divergent thinking, potentially more convergent thinking. Right, so important to actually check that. What's happening in groups in conditions of synchrony? Are there possible negative effects, for example, reduced synchrony, reduced creativity? And so what we actually did is we gave people a test of divergent thinking. So, how many different uses for a paperclip can you come up with in the next 30 seconds or next minute? And we also gave them a test of convergent thinking, where you saw 3 words that apparently had nothing to do with each other, and you had to find something that actually is common to all 3 words, right? So yeah, now you have to think about what is the right answer for this one here, right? So divergent thinking, we use this kind of alternative uses test. For convergent thinking, we had these 3 words, and people had to find out what is actually common to them. What we actually found, and this is work also by Renita, is people in conditions of synchrony came up with fewer ideas, came up with less novel ideas. But at the same time, they also seem to select, or were better able to actually find connections between these 3 words, right? So there could be potential negative sides for synchronous behavior, because it could actually reduce the novelty and the innovativeness of solutions in groups. On the other hand, it might actually help individuals in groups to find the best solution better if they shared their information effectively. Right? So there could be potential dark sides or dark aspects to ritual. So the take-home point here so far is that synchronized behaviors, chanting, singing, dancing, etc., decreases divergent thinking, but potentially increases convergent thinking. But as I mentioned before, rituals are multidimensional. And now I'm going to embark on a different line of research, which I think is really, really fascinating, which is the question of why people do sometimes very extreme things to their body, which they would not be willing to do in ritual context, in ordinary context, like piercing themselves, as you can see here, with spears, walking over fire, bathing in ice cold waters, etc. The idea here, going back to all sorts of different anthropological researches again, is that potentially there's something going on with signals again. By doing these extreme actions, you signal both to yourself and to others that you're committed to the group. So there all sorts of variations of this. There's, initially Bill Irons came up with the idea, but there are variations of this. Joe Bulbulia has talked about charismatic signaling. Rick Sosis and Joe Hendrick, they have developed their own versions, variations of these signaling ideas. The idea really is that by performing these incredible acts that often be, very hard to believe, you actually signal to everyone that you're committed to the group. So it's a kind of an honest signal to others that shows commitment to the group and actually also deters free riders. And so I had a great privilege to work with a dear friend and colleague, Dimitris Sigalatis, in a very far-flung little island in the middle of nowhere, where we were able to actually test some of those ideas in a naturalistic setting. The cool thing is, by looking at these extreme rituals in real-world conditions, you can't get ethics to do this kind of stuff in lab experiments. So we have to look at events in the natural world where people do this in order to test some of these ideas. So what we did is we used naturally occurring variation in rituals. So people that, for example, would pierce themselves on that day and walk barefoot over really, really hot asphalt for hours and hours, and then at the end climb a little mountain and do some ritualistic performances at the top of the mountain in a temple, right? So very harsh thing to do on your body, very, very painful. And then there were those individuals that were actually accompanying them. So they were working with them, but they had shoes on, they were able to drink, they were not pierced. And so obviously they were perceiving what was going on, but they were not personally, physically suffering. And then there were individuals that performed a very calm chanting rituals a couple of days beforehand. So we had three groups of individuals that varied systematically in the amount of, physical pain that was inflicted on the body. But importantly, all three groups actually underwent some kind of ritual. And so what we looked at is how much money they shared or donated to the temple. So we gifted money. There was a very intriguing, very kind of smart and smart way of actually tracking the money. Have a look at the paper and to find out how we actually did that. And so what we found is, a couple of days before the ritual, right, people gave about a little bit less than 50% away to the temple. On the day of the ritual, the amount increased dramatically, and in some cases, it was nearly, some people gave the complete amount to the temple actually. So the observers and the performers actually did not differ significantly from each other, even though there seems to be a slightly lower level here. But the important thing here is greater perceived pain was associated with more donation. So this was really the crucial point here, that the pain component seems to be driving this pro-social reaction. So doing things together, like you signal your commitment to others, and then you also act in more pro-social way. So the curious question now, I've been talking so much about synchrony. What about synchrony versus pain? Because both of them seem to have some kind of positive effect on social cooperation. So let's test this. And this is some work together with a dear colleague in Thailand. We tested that in a setting where you see some pictures here, where people over 9 days, they undergo all sorts of different rituals. As you can see, some very calm rituals, but also firecrackers, walking over holes, piercing themselves. So here you see some images of people running over fire, and so it's an incredible, it's an incredible experience to observe those 9 days. I promised you I would talk a little bit about what anthropologists and other more kind of social science researchers have done. So for example, here's some work by Margaret Chan that has been tracking these rituals of how they actually evolved probably about 5,000 years ago in southern China, and then dispersed across Southeast Asia, and fused with some of the indigenous cultures in different areas to take on specific portions. So what you saw there, even though it's conducted in Thailand, these rituals, these are actually southern Chinese rituals that came with the Chinese diaspora um, in these different regions. And so I talked about it's a 9-day ritual, and people like Arnold von Gennep, a central scholar on rituals, he focused on these specific stages of rituals. And so what he talked about, there are these separation rituals that like mark the separation of the everyday profane from the sacred one. Then after you have done these kind of rituals that mark the separation, you have the focal part of the ritual where the action is, where like the magic is happening, where things are going on, where like the important aspects of rituals are taking place. And then of course you need to separate the magic again from the everyday life, and so you have to have some kind of rituals that separate the magic and bring everything back to the normal world, right? So what I did here is I separated out all these different rituals, and the important thing for us right now is that the synchrony versus most of the painful rituals happen during these March, like these central stages of the ritual, where both the very painful, very painful from an outsider perspective, but also the highly synchronized activities are taking place. And so this allows us, because people do both. They take part in these synchronized actions, they take part in these very painful actions. There are synchronized actions that are not painful, there are synchronized actions that are painful, and they're also, and vice versa. So we have nearly a perfect crossover. So this really allowed us to test some of these ideas. What's actually happening to individuals after they went through this, right? So after you, for example, inserted some nice little saw into your cheek, we were not able to use behavioral games. We talked to the temple authorities, and unfortunately it was not possible for very spiritual religious reasons. People were not allowed to handle money or deal with these kind of things. So in the end we had to go with a self-report measure, identity fusion, and some identification measures. What we found overall, there was no effect of synchrony in this context. It was very interesting. But there was an effect of pain. So more painful rituals resulted in a more positive pro-social reaction. And interestingly, there were differences between males and females. So for males, the pro-social responses were much stronger in painful rituals that were synchronized, where typically a lot of males would do very painful things together. On the other hand, the pro-social tendencies of women were much stronger in painful rituals where there was no synchrony. So where women then alone would do very objectively painful things, but they would do them in isolation, not in together with others. So which really, like if you think about it from a signaling perspective, in the paper we speculate a little bit about this. This really raises some very interesting questions, what's actually going on with signaling. And one of the important aspects here, unfortunately, is people in evolutionary theory always talk about signaling is important, but who signals what to whom? And unfortunately, gender or sex, so sex, the biological gender, the identification part, is really understudied, and also in evolutionary theory. So what is actually being signaled by men versus women in these rituals might be quite different. But gender or sex differences are often not really central in these studies, so we don't have a lot of information. So bringing all of this together, research on rituals is highly diverse, super exciting. The area that I've been working with has looked at rituals as kind of an evolutionary adaptation. So that is the working hypothesis, and there might be something to this. But like one of the great challenges and barriers for us is to actually think through how these kind of adaptations, potentially evolved and function over our evolutionary history, right? So what are the psychological, what are the physiological, and what are the neurocognitive mechanisms? So I talked a little bit about some of these ideas, the mirror neurons. I talked a little bit about, for example, the collective effervescence. There's some very interesting theories as well on how our hormonal system is involved. So there are really cool ideas out there. And the amazing thing is there's so much work still to be done. And if you're interested in getting involved, get in touch. And I'm very happy to talk to you about this. Thanks a lot. And any questions, send a message, write a comment, and I'll try and get back to you. Thanks a lot for your attention.